Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 10th of July, and today was a pretty slow news day, but nonetheless we're going to be covering the events that did actually unfold today along the front line. And we're going to start off with the situation around Yakovlivka, which I find to be very interesting, because this general sector, which is a bit to the north of both Bakhmut and Soledar, this sector that spans, from Mykolaievka to Bilohorivka, it's really not been talked about widely on the entire front line in comparison to other sectors. But I do find it to be a very interesting area where admittedly there has not been that much activity, but now we're seeing some more. And so basically the Russians, they took over Yakovlivka, if recalling correctly, about half a year ago, maybe a bit more. And since then they've sort of used Yakovlivka as a stepping stone to conduct flanking operations towards Solidar, and that really helped out in the assault on that town on the northern flank as they were advancing from the southern part of Soledar. And then after they took Soledar, the Russians continued their advance on the northern flank and began flanking Bakhmut from the north as well. And so Yakovlivka really sort of precipitated this Russian flanking operation, which assisted with their offensive activities at the beginning of the year. So with the Russians controlling this town, I was one of the people at the time talking about how they would push in the direction of Vesele, because Vesele is this pretty small town. I would consider it a hamlet. And, there's this very minor river, the Suka Plotova River, that runs to the north of it. And that's about it. This town is very isolated. It's just surrounded by these low elevated open fields, and there's barely any pathways to enter the town. And even if there is one through the open fields, then all of those are probably under Russian artillery barrages, and so it's very difficult to resupply and reinforce the individuals defending over here. But if my mapping from half a year ago is still correct, with the units, then the 118th Cherkasy Defense Brigade is still defending this area, and it seems they've been very successful in doing so, which I find to be very, very interesting. And so the Russians have failed, for the most part, to expand their zone of control to the north of Yakovlivka. Really, the most they've been able to achieve is perhaps advances of about 1.3 miles to the north of the town of Yakovlivka since they took it over, and that's really about it. And then a bit to the west of Vesela, you have Novoselivkse, which is a larger town where you do have a pretty significant amount of Ukrainian forces, and they come from the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, which is very, very battle hardened. They've been fighting here for basically a year in this area around Novoselivkse, around Yakovlivka, Solidar, and so they have great experience in this sort of proactive defense. And so there around Novoselivkse, they've been putting pressure on the Russians, trying to hold them back from advancing towards Novoselivkse, and they have been successful in doing so for many months now. They've also been conducting their own localized counterattacks towards Sakoy, even Seti, and Mykolaievka. And in addition, you have the 54th Mechanized Brigade, which today actually did go on the offensive towards Yakovlivka, and specifically the 3rd Mechanized Battalion of the 54th Brigade. They sent in some smaller columns and some tanks and armored personnel carriers in the direction of Yakovlivka, and this is basically the way that they did it, through this certain path from Novoselivkse towards this lake over here, and then trying to advance through some of the different minor roads or minor paths that are adjacent to certain bush lines, and then from there to make their way into Yakovlivka through some of the valleys. And so it seems like they have not been able to break through into Yakovlivka just yet, but they did release some video footage of the 3rd Mechanized Battalion, and in it, it did show them sort of dismounting small infantry groups. And again, these are very small squads, and these groups from there, they're trying to advance through the different bush lines to make their way into Yakovlivka in these very small formations. And it's very similar to what we're seeing going on with the Zaporozhye counteroffensive at this point, and also in Klishchiivka in sort of way, which is pretty interesting. And so they have continued pushing in this direction. The Ukrainian sources claim that they have advanced basically 3 kilometers into the Russian line with this most recent line of assault. So that could be like 1.8 miles. Perhaps they reach this area over here that I'm going over with my cursor, which would mean that they have positions in some of the bush lines that are to the north of Yakovlivka. Perhaps there are some trenches over there. But again, no major breakthrough into the town of Yakovlivka just yet. These are still pretty minor attacks and not enough to break through. The Russians do have in this area artillery, mortar, and anti tank fire, which has been attempting to keep the Ukrainians at bay. But we do know that at the very least, the Ukrainian forward attacks were able to reach this dismounting point over here and this dismounting point over here. But again, the situation is fluid. None of the forces are staying in one spot. They're moving around, trying to get closer or having to retreat back to the main town where all of these attacks are being coordinated in Novoselivkse. And by the way, in the video that was provided by the 3rd Mechanized Battalion, the town of Novoselivkse was heavily damaged by Russian shelling. And even as the Ukrainian columns began to leave the town, they are already being shelled by the Russians because it is so close to the front line. Look at the distance from Yakovlivka. It's only like 3 miles. It's only 1 mile away from the actual line of contact with the Russians. So we'll update that situation if anything changes. But just quickly about Klishchiivka. In this region, I don't have anything to report about changes. But something interesting is that Ramzan Kadyrov, he reports that the Ahmad Special Forces have been deployed to the Klishchiivka sector and generally to the southern Bakhmut flank. And he says that one of his subordinates, who's also a general for the Ahmad forces, Abki Alandimor, he says that he has been at the front line and he's checked the entire situation, and that it seems that it's now more under control and that there's not as much fear of a Ukrainian breakthrough. So that's his own words, not mine. But it does seem like, yeah, the front line has sort of stabilized for now, but obviously we're going to see that change in the coming days, and we'll report it in when that happens. But I'm not surprised that now Chechens are being spotted in this area. Maybe it's not a significant amount, and maybe more will be sent in the future. But we do remember that after the Wagner Group announced in May that they would begin their withdrawal from Bakhmut, that Kadyrov did volunteer his own forces to come in and fill the ranks. And we know that the Russian regular army did fill the ranks beforehand, but there was always this talk from Kadyrov that the Chechen forces would come in and help assist as well. And so maybe this is now the manifestation of that, because Klishchiivka is certainly an area that Russia needs to maintain under its control in order to secure the flanks around Bakhmut, in order to prevent a Ukrainian counterattack into the city itself. And so who knows, maybe that is something that is going on now in terms of the Russian troop catalog on the front line. Now, moving on to the Kreminna direction, where we did have the most movement. In this general area, the Russians have been able to advance past the previous gray zone, which was to the west of the town of Dibrova, which was under Russian control, a very small town. It's also sort of their fort position in this area, and Ukraine has been trying to assault it for many months now. But the Russians have been able to expand their buffer zone around the town. Now the front line is about 3 miles away from Dibrova, and you could see the distances over here. My cursor, and so now the Russians are approaching the Zherbets River, approaching towns such as Torshke, Zarichny, Yampolivka, Terny, all these towns adjacent to the river. They're probably not going to attempt to take them over anytime soon, but what this does do is that it gives Russians more of a breather around some of their towns on the front line, like Dibrova, like I said before, and Kreminna, which was at serious danger of falling when the original Kharkiv counteroffensive occurred, but now the front line is about 7 miles away from Kreminna, and the Russians are prepared with lines of defense and reserves in that area. But thinking into the very long term, it does give the Russians the opportunity to reach the Zherbets River, and it's absolutely necessary that the Russians, if they ever want to have aspirations of retaking Liman, which I'm sure they do at some point in the future, then they need to have a bridgehead across the Zherbets River to do so. And so that's part of why they're attempting to make these minor gains in this area. And in terms of what they did gain, this square should basically visualize what they were able to take. So what they did take is several different strong points within the forest to the south of Dibrova. And, these are generally just dugouts for a small amount of Ukrainian forces, and so they were able to dislodge them using artillery, aviation, and then their own infantry storming these dugouts. But I've seen from some Russian sources that there is a Ukrainian effort in the future to conduct counterattacks in this direction to reverse some of the Russian gains. And that does sort of follow through with what I've been seeing with the movement of new equipment and new units towards the Luhansk, Kreminna direction. So there's new Ukrainian units that are being moved to the front line. And just to note some of them, you have like 66th Brigade. This is a relatively new unit in this area. 11th Brigade, it's been there for a while, I would say. Same thing with the 1st Special Purpose Brigade. There's also the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, which is one of those new era brigades created in early 2023, which just finished basic training, is now being sent in. And so you see now the shipment of, 2, 3 new brigades into this area. It's not saying that they're going to conduct any sort of massive attack to break through into Kreminna, but it does mean that they're going to try to shape the battlefield in a way that is more favorable than it is now for the Ukrainian forces. And finally, we're going to discuss the situation around Novoselivkse, where the Russians have actually been pushed back a little bit. They were initially able to clear out one block to the west of the highway. The one that I marked was this red rectangle. And so now they've been pushed out. So their frontal assault was unsuccessful in this direction. And so the Russians have focused their efforts now on pushing from the south in order to secure some of the heights that are to the south of Novoselivkse. So let's go to the topographic map and look at the extent of the elevation in this area. So you can see that the Russians are beginning their attacks on Novoselivkse from Klishchiivka, which is on a very low elevation, 400 feet. It's on a valley. And this is compared to Novoselivkse, which is, about 610 feet above sea level, which is pretty significant, and it gives Ukraine advantage in this general area. All of the fields that are surrounding Novoselivkse are also on high ground, and Ukraine controls most of them. And so this gives them an amazing position to fire onto the Russian troops who are on the attacking mode. So Ukraine does have the advantage. So what Russia's trying to do is they're trying to take these heights to the south, not so they'll be able to overlook Novoselivkse, because those heights are on pretty equal elevation with Novoselivkse, but what it will give them is an opportunity to at least be on equal footing and to continue their attacks, perhaps to flank from the south. Because it's clear now that their frontal assaults on Novoselivkse, perhaps they could go a block or two deep into the town, but they are certainly suffering significant casualties in the process in this house by house fighting. So what Russia's opted to do is take these positions to the south, these southern fields, which are, you see, also very similar elevation depending on where you click. Sometimes it's 600 feet, sometimes it's even 610 feet, 620 feet. And so it is significant. And it would also allow the Russians to fire onto the Ukrainian positions a bit to the west in some of these other lower elevated areas, like around Berestove, where all these supplies are coming in from towards the front line, and also in this other valley area that I have marked in blue over here. And so that's their rationale. So that's really it for today. Really, the only other thing that is worth mentioning are the rumors. Again, they're just rumors about Putin firing Valery Gerasimov, who's the Joint Chief of Staff. And so that's totally unconfirmed. Don't believe that until you see actual confirmation. But I'm just throwing it out there until that, in the case that actually ends up being a reality. But that's really it for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.